This 1920 wedding portrait looked happy at first, until you notice what the bride hides in her hand. David Harper had seen thousands of old photographs during his 15 years as a historian at the New Orleans Heritage Museum, but something about this one made him stop immediately. It was a humid Tuesday afternoon in April 2024 when he was opening a new donation from the estate of Eleanor Ruza, a woman who had died at the age of 103. She had left behind boxes of family items that no relatives wanted to keep. The photograph was wrapped carefully in yellow tissue paper, inside a silver frame that was worn but still solid. David lifted it toward the light coming through his office window. The image showed a black wedding couple from 1883. The bride wore an ivory dress with fine lace sleeves and a long veil. The groom stood beside her in a dark, neatly pressed suit with a small boutonniere pinned to his lapel. They posed in front of a decorated studio backdrop common for that time. Their faces had the still, serious look early cameras required. The bride stood out. She was not considered traditionally beautiful by the standards of that era, but her eyes were powerful and direct, fixed firmly on the camera. Her dark hair was arranged carefully under her veil, and she wore a simple pearl necklace. The groom stood slightly behind her, one hand placed properly on her shoulder, his expression calm and dignified. For a black couple to afford a professional wedding portrait in Louisiana in 1883, only 18 years after slavery ended, said a lot about their determination. They wanted this moment preserved. They wanted proof they existed. David turned the frame over, hoping to find names or dates. On the back, written in faded brown ink, were just two names and a date, Clara and Thomas, June 14, 1883. Nothing else. He turned the photo back and studied it again. The image was unusually clear for its age, clearly protected and passed down with care through generations. As the afternoon light shifted and hit the glass at a new angle, David noticed something strange. He reached for the magnifying glass he kept on his desk. Leaning closer, he focused on the bride's hands, folded neatly at her waist, just as brides often posed back then. But something was in her right hand. David's heart began to race as he adjusted the lens. Between her fingers, partly hidden by her dress and the angle of her hands, was a small piece of fabric. At first, it looked like part of her gown or a simple handkerchief. Brides often held such things, but the way she gripped it felt intentional. There was tension in her fingers, even frozen in a photograph more than a century old. David placed the photograph under a bright archival lamp. The extra light revealed more detail. The fabric was white or cream-colored, about the size of a man's pocket square. As he looked closer, he noticed markings on it. Very small, neat markings that looked like stitching. His hands shook slightly as he took several high-resolution photos and uploaded them to his computer. Using enhancement software, he zoomed in and adjusted the contrast. The markings became clearer. They were not decorative. They were careful and organized, almost like symbols or measurements. The stitches looked like numbers and directional signs. David leaned back, stunned. In 1883, Louisiana was deep in the violent aftermath of Reconstruction. Black communities lived in constant danger. White supremacist groups were growing stronger, civil rights were being stripped away, and terror was used to force black people back into silence. For a black bride to hide something like this in her wedding portrait meant it was important. He looked again at Thomas's face. His eyes showed no fear, but a deep awareness, a seriousness beyond normal wedding nerves. Clara's lips were tight, as if she was holding something in, holding her breath. David knew he had found something meaningful, but he didn't yet understand what it was. Why hide coded information in a wedding photo? That night, he barely slept. The next morning, he arrived at the museum early, the photograph safely stored in an archival sleeve. He needed answers. First, he needed to know who Clara and Thomas were. He searched marriage records, church books, city directories, and census files. Hours passed as he carefully checked handwritten documents. By mid-morning, he found a match, a marriage license from Orleans Parish. Clara, age 24. Thomas, age 27, married June 14th on 0800. And 83 Thomas was listed as a carpenter, and their address placed them in the TMA neighborhood, one of the oldest black communities in America. That discovery filled David with excitement. TMA was known for strength, culture, and quiet resistance. People there protected each other and knew when to keep secrets. David searched property records next and found that Thomas had purchased land on St. Philip Street in 1881. Property ownership for a black man at that time was rare and dangerous. It meant courage. David then turned to old newspapers. Most papers only mentioned black citizens when reporting crimes, often with racist language. But while reading between the lines, David noticed repeated reports from 1883 and 1884 about black families disappearing from neighborhoods like TMA. The articles blamed irresponsibility, but David suspected something else. He reached out to Dr. Angela Freeman, a textile historian at Tulane University. When she arrived and saw the images, her excitement was immediate. She explained that the stitching was not decoration. It was coded information. Black communities had long used fabric to share messages when writing was too dangerous. Quilts were the most famous example, but handkerchiefs and clothing were also used. Angela pointed out patterns that worked like a compass, marking directions and distances. These were not random. They likely led to SAF. Places. The Underground Railroad, she explained, did not end with the Civil War. It adapted during Reconstruction and after its collapse. People still needed ways to escape violence. She showed David historical maps and explained how dangerous Louisiana was in 1883. Federal protection was gone. Terror ruled. The fabric Clara held may have been a map or a guide to others who had already fled. Over the following days, David studied TMA's history. The neighborhood had once been a center of black life and pride, but by 1883 it was under attack. Voting rights were stripped away. Violence went unpunished. Churches became meeting places and safe hubs. David wondered if Clara and Thomas were married at St. Augustine Church, a key institution in the community. One Saturday morning, David visited the neighborhood. The exact house was gone, but many buildings from the 1800s remained. Walking the streets, he imagined horse-drawn carts, gas lamps, and constant fear. At St. Augustine Church, an elderly woman named Mrs. Delqua welcomed him. When he mentioned Clara and Thomas and the year 1883, her eyes brightened. She led him to old ledgers and carefully opened the book, slowly turning. The fragile pages there, written in elegant handwriting, was the entry. Clara, spinster, and Thomas, bachelor, joined in holy marriage on the 14th day of June, in the year of our Lord, 1883. But it was a small note in the margin that made David's heart begin to pound. Witnesses, Samuel and Ruth, and beside their names, written so lightly it was almost missed, was a single word: conductors. That word changed everything. David knew exactly what it meant. Conductors were the people who guided enslaved men, women, and children to freedom through the Underground Railroad. But the Underground Railroad was believed to have ended with the Civil War in 1865. Why would conductors still be listed in 1883, almost 20 years after emancipation? Mrs. Delqua saw the question forming in David's eyes. She motioned for him to sit, then lowered herself into a chair with the slow care of someone who carried many years of memories. "Young man," she said softly, "the Underground Railroad never really stopped. It only changed. My grandmother told me stories. She was born in 1879 and lived through all of this. After Reconstruction failed, after the soldiers left and the violence came back even worse, black people still needed ways out." She lowered her voice, almost whispering, as if the walls could hear. They called it different things then. The network, the chain. Some just called it the way through. It wasn't about running north anymore. That road was known and watched. Sometimes it was blocked. This was about moving quietly between safe places, about disappearing when your name ended up on the wrong list, when your family was threatened, when there was no other option. David showed her the enhanced image of the wedding photograph and pointed to the fabric in Clara's hand. Mrs. Delqua studied it for a long time, then nodded slowly. "My grandmother spoke about something like this," she said. "She called them passage cloths. Women carried them because women were searched less and questioned less. The information was hidden in plain sight, made to look like decoration or something sentimental. "Do you know where these markings might have led?" David asked. Mrs. Delacroix stood and walked to a large map of Louisiana on the wall, covered with pins and handwritten notes from past research. "In the 1880s, she said, there were places that took people in. Some were deep in the bay where the law rarely went. Others were farming communities farther north near the Arkansas border, where black families already lived and protected new cars." Then she paused, her finger hovering near the Gulf Coast. "And there were the water routes, ships, black sailors, fishermen, dock workers. They moved people through New Orleans harbor to ports farther east and north, Mobile, Pensacola, even Charleston. From there, people could start over. Some even left the country. Mexico, the Caribbean, anywhere away from the terror." David felt everything begin to connect. Clara's fabric may not have shown only land paths. It could have included ship routes, schedules, names of trusted contacts at the docks. The repeating patterns Angela had noticed likely marked the safest routes, the ones that worked again and again. "What happened to Samuel and Ruth?" David asked. Mrs. Delacroix's face grew heavy. "I can look through the records," she said, but her voice faded. David understood. Conductors lived dangerous lives. Many vanished. Some were killed. Others were forced to flee. Back at the museum, David and Angela worked late into the night. The wedding portrait filled a large screen beside old maps of Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. They brought in Marcus, a cryptography specialist from the museum's geography department. Together, they tried to turn Clara's stitched symbols into real locations. Marcus explained the difficulty. "The landmarks and measurement systems from 1883 aren't the same as today. Rivers have shifted. Roads disappeared. Entire communities no longer exist. We're trying to read a map of a world that's gone." Angela carefully sketched every symbol from the fabric, laying them out in order. "I think this first group marks starting points, places inside New Orleans. See how they're close together and linked by short lines? These would be safe houses, meeting spots before a journey began." David compared the directions with old street maps of TMA from 1883. One matched an area near St. Augustine Church. Another lined up with the French Market, where crowds could hide secret meetings. A third pointed toward Bayou St. John, where water led into the swamps. "Now look at these longer lines," Angela said, tracing them. "These show the escape paths. One goes northwest, likely along the Mississippi River. One heads north toward Mississippi or Arkansas. And this one curves southeast, toward the coast." Marcus pulled up an 1883 shipping chart. If they used ships, they'd need to know which docks were safe and which captains could be trusted. "Look here," he said. "There's a regular service between New Orleans and Mobile. Small ships, mixed cargo. That would have been perfect for moving people quietly. Hour by hour, a hidden network took shape. Every mark Clara carried was not just a place, but a lifeline. Someone's chance to survive, a family's escape from violence, a community protecting its own." Near midnight, Marcus leaned back and rubbed his eyes. "You see what this means? Clara wasn't carrying this just for herself. She was a conductor. Probably Thomas, too. This portrait wasn't only a wedding memory. It was a backup, a way to save vital information if everything else was destroyed." David looked again at Clara's face, seeing her differently now. She was so young, barely in her 20s, risking everything. Even owning this knowledge could have meant death. David needed to know what happened next. He returned to the archives, searching death records, property transfers, census files. He found Thomas first. In 1891, the St. Philip Street property had been transferred into Clara's name alone. Beside it was one word, widow. David's chest tightened. Thomas had died sometime before then, still young. A death record from March 1889 listed the cause simply as injuries sustained. No explanation, just two vague words. In Louisiana at that time, for a black man involved and resistance, that could mean anything. David sat in silence, feeling the weight of it. Clara's story did not end there. She appeared in the 1900 census, still on St. Philip Street, listed as a seamstress living alone. She appeared again in 1910, now 60, still working, still there. Then David found something that made everything painfully clear. In an oral history interview from the 1930s, recorded by the Federal Writer Project, there was a woman identified only as CR, age 80, from New Orleans. The notes described her as dignified and careful with her words. She spoke of helping families find safe paths after her husband's death. She mentioned sewing special cloths women could carry. She spoke of fear and constant watchfulness. One passage struck David deeply. "They took my Thomas for helping people reach safety, said he was causing trouble, interfering with the natural order. But we knew the truth. Freedom didn't end with the war. It had to be fought for every day. The cloth I carried on my wedding day was my promise to him, to our people. I kept that promise long after he was gone." David sat still, holding the transcript. Clara had continued alone for decades, using her sewing to keep the network alive. He traced her story forward and found she died in 1932, age 73. The property passed to a niece named Rose. That trail led him to Patricia, Rose's granddaughter. When David called her, there was a long silence. "You found Aunt Clara's wedding photo?" she said quietly. "We thought it was lost in Katrina." They met the next day at Patricia's home. She showed him a shoebox filled with papers and photos. She told him her grandmother said Clara was the bravest woman she knew. Patricia then pulled out a fragile piece of fabric, larger than the one in the portrait, covered in the same tiny stitching. "Clara gave this to Rose before she died," she said. Then she brought out a small leather journal. Clara's journal. Inside were years of quiet notes, coded entries David now understood. One from June 14, 1920 read, "Thomas, I kept my promise." The way through remains open. 3 months after discovering the portrait, David stood in the museum gallery at a new exhibition. Clara and Thomas's wedding photograph stood beside the passage cloths and the journal. Visitors filled the room. Some recognized places, some recognized names. An elderly man pointed to one location on the map and said it had been his great-grandfather's farm. Schoolchildren stood silently before Clara's image. One girl asked why Clara kept going after her husband died. David answered honestly, she was afraid, but her love for her people was stronger than her fear. On June 14, 2025, the museum held a memorial. Clara's family stood together before the portrait. As the gallery emptied, David stood alone. Clara looked back at him, her hand still holding that small cloth. What seemed like a simple wedding photo had become proof of courage, a record of resistance, a reminder that the fight for dignity never truly ends. It only changes, carried forward by ordinary people making brave choices.